So the title is, What Were the Russians Watching? Thank you to the Mystic Noank Library for inviting me to do this. I enjoy doing these very much, and it's great. Someday I hope to come to the library and maybe do a talk in person like we did back in normal times. Let me make sure I'm getting my... Okay. Well, the first talk that Eric alluded to that I did was called Hollywood and the Atomic Bomb, and this is a sequel. When I was a kid, as anyone around my age will remember doing the same thing, this is what we were doing back in the 1950s when we were in school. It was duck and cover time in the Cold War. And it was, for me, a really a scary experience, frankly. And after these drills, you know, I'd go home, do my homework, and then switch on $1 Million Movie and watch TV, maybe Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or maybe switch over to Twilight Zone. Movies and television gave our generation a great way to process the atomic age and our fears of the Cold War. And that, of course, is the abiding image, the mushroom cloud from the Cold War time. And this is the literal embodiment of the atom bomb walking. He was kind of a walking, breathing nuclear reactor of destruction and terror. And I would watch him incessantly on TV. Well, I began to wonder, what were the Russians watching? What were, when I began to wonder, I mean, this is the last few years when I started researching this. What were the kids of our time back then doing? Well, we were hiding under our desks. You know, did they have air raid drills? Were they afraid of Americans the way we were afraid of Russians? And what were they watching on TV? Well, I realized quickly enough that most Russian families couldn't afford televisions yet. That was something in America, but not necessarily in, you know, Russian households. But there was a lot to learn, and I found out what they were watching. Well, these two fellows are pretty recognizable icons. I'm sure you know the guy on the left. The guy on the right is Joseph Stalin. And one of these two men was a tremendous admirer of the other. And one of these two men tried to get the other guy assassinated. Well, the answer to that riddle is easy, and that's Joseph Stalin loved watching John Wayne movies. But he didn't like it when he heard John Wayne criticizing communism so vocally, and he got angry, and he told his people he wanted John Wayne assassinated. This is a true story. And his people very nervously tried to talk him out of it, which they managed to do. Wasn't necessarily a safe thing to try and talk Stalin out of anything. Now, Stalin was a serious film buff, and if anyone's seen the magnificent movie, A Comedy of Terrors, as it was called, it's a satire, but it's not just a lot of laughs like most satires. It's actually a pretty scary film because it shows a lot of what really happened. It's this remarkable mixture of history and farce. And I recommend it highly, The Death of Stalin. It starts out with Stalin forcing Nikita Khrushchev and Beria and his other lieutenants into staying up all night and watching John Wayne films with him. Well, this wasn't just a little hobby. I mean, you know, any of us might stay up late to watch movies. It wasn't just a hobby of Stalin's or an obsession, or rather, it was a real obsession. And the scholars of the time have coined a term called cinematocracy to describe how deeply involved, this is in the 1930s, we're talking about, Stalin was in the film industry in Russia, which was, of course, very much a propaganda engine for the state. And Stalin's favorite movie of the time, called Volga Volga from 1938, which I've seen a long clip of in its original black and white version, is kind of a feel-good film about a band of Russian amateur performers who go on this boat ride, and most of the film takes place in the boat ride. They're doing singing and dancing. It's a musical, and they're going to a talent show in Moscow. This is just an example of the kind of stuff that was being produced by the Russian cinema. And Stalin himself personally got involved in things. He fancied himself a producer, director, writer, censor, and more. He would coach the actors, tell them what to do, approve scripts. He got so involved in doing this that scholars have termed it cinematocracy. Well, shortly thereafter, of course, comes World War II, and that put an end for quite a while to the Russian film industry, as they had to take on the job of putting all the resources into dealing with the invasion of the German Wehrmacht in 1941. So interestingly, they became our allies in World War II, and as many people still don't realize, and to help the American people understand that the Russians, who were called godless communists in the 20s and 30s, were now our allies. Hollywood produced some really remarkable movies to help the propaganda effort here in the West to help people understand the people of Russia. And they include these two movies that were, one of them, The North Star, the screenplay was by none other than Lillian Hellman. And I could talk about these movies. They're really wonderful. You can get a hold of them and watch them, especially North Star. That's the real gem of the group, with a great cast. And what happened to a few years later, after the war, the House Un-American Activities Committee started doing, of course, all the investigations that led to the Hollywood 10 debacle and all of that. They invited Ayn Rand, the famous author, to come and testify. They asked her to do an analysis of these films, and she testified that these were part of the communist influence in Hollywood to promote socialism and communism. And the guy who did the screenplay for Song of Russia, his career was destroyed over it. Anyway, World War II was a terrible disaster for the world. Tens of millions of people died on the battlefield and among civilians. But it's important to compare and understand the difference between the terrible, disastrous experience for the United Kingdom and the United States with all those lives lost, but compare the numbers to the Soviet Union. And numbers are still being researched and disputed by scholars. Anywhere between 9 and 11 million battlefield deaths in the military, and 27 million total civilian and military deaths. Now, not only did people die, of course, there was tremendous disease, hunger, the devastation of the infrastructure, all the bombing and shelling. I mean, Russia was badly, badly beaten down, but they survived, and they beat back the Wehrmacht, and they ended up, of course, invading from the east. They invaded Germany. And what they did when they got there, among other things, was they decided to do some looting of places in Berlin, as was done by armies in World War II and since time immemorial. And one of the things that they decided to do is they decided to get a collection, or pull together a collection of films that they got. They actually got 10,000 movie films that range from documentaries to full-length features in all sorts of languages from all over the world. A large part of it came from Joseph Goebbels' personal library of films, Goebbels being Hitler's propaganda minister. And these movies were brought back to Moscow, and they were known as Trofejni filmy, or trophy films. And after a couple of years, the Ministry of Culture reviewed some of these films, worked on them, did some editing, did some dubbing, or basically got them ready so that the Russian people could watch them. Among them were 46 American Hollywood movies, and they were, in the late 40s, finally released to movie theaters in Russia, and they became very popular. And again, this Stalin These are films from the 1930s, Hollywood films from the 30s. Stalin loved all these movies. He was a big fan of Charlie Chaplin, as well as John Wayne and others. And when you went to the movie theaters in Moscow, before a film would come up, you would see this on the screen. This film was captured as a military trophy in the course of the Great War for our motherland. And then the film would come on. So this basically, while we were watching what we were watching in America on TV and in the theaters, Russians got to go to the movies. They didn't have a television set, but they got to do this. And they got to see some of the approved movies that were available. Mark of Zorro, Stagecoach, with John Wayne, Adventures of Robin Hood, Errol Flynn, Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which makes you wonder how they looked at our political system through that movie, and Romeo and Juliet. The Russians certainly knew who Shakespeare was. So the Russians were going to the movies, but they were not watching. There were no monsters, no aliens, no ray guns, no UFOs, spies, or American enemies. So while back home, we're watching The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms invading New York, and on the lower right, no, that's not a picture from last month's insurrection in Washington. That's from Earth versus the Flying Saucers, one of my favorite sci-fi films of the time. And it's very much a specific kind of, you could call it an allegory for the idea of what if the Russians were in the flying saucers. Aliens, Russians, you know, we sort of mashed up them together in our sci-fi movies. And if you were afraid of aliens, you know, you were sort of really having your fears stoked up about the possibility of Russians coming over. And our military's investigations into flying saucers really had a lot to do with their fears that it was the Russians that had secret weapons, and that was what people were seeing up in the skies. Now, among all the movies that the Russians were seeing in the 1950s, there was a particular series of films starring a particular famous actor in the title role. There were no other films that were anywhere near as popular. And when I mean popular, I mean by a factor of 10. 10 times the tickets were sold to these movies than to any of the other movies, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or whatever. And that superstar in Russia was none other than Johnny Weissmuller as Tarzan of the Apes. Now, this might seem funny or just a little bit of an oddball factoid, but in fact, this really was a interesting and larger story, which I'll tell you a bit about. Tarzan was certainly not new to the Russians in the early 1950s. 30 years earlier, the Soviet Ministry of Culture approved the translation and distribution of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan novels. They decided that Tarzan grew up in the jungle, uncontaminated by Western cultural influence, and that he was raised by a tribe of, quote, proletarian apes, unquote. This is true. This has been studied. A journal article written by an American scholar explains how Soviet youth longed for the individual freedom that Tarzan came to represent. And Tarzan remains popular in Russia today. Joseph Brodsky, the Nobel Prize-winning poet and he came over to the United States. He was emigrated from Russia. In any case, he, born in 1942, was a young teenager during these days, and he loved Tarzan. And he and his buddies loved Tarzan. He wrote later in a memoir, "The rise of free thinking in the Soviet Union, the emancipation of consciousness in general, for my generation, begins with Tarzan. This was the first movie in which we saw natural life and long hair." And that marvelous cry of Tarzan, which, as you remember, hung over every Russian city. And we don't know this, but he and his fellow, his peers of the time, they would literally, he talks about this, go out and they would imitate Tarzan's cry. Do that famous thing that Johnny Weissmuller did so well. I've tried it. I don't do a good job at it. So Tarzan was a big thing. And think about it. This is really, you know, you couldn't get direct criticism of Russian life or comparisons to Russian life that would be negative. And so, you know, this is sort of a way that, oddly enough, Stalin, the Ministry of Culture, kind of let through, and it had this effect. There's another wonderful still you can, this reminds me of something Stalin did in the 1930s. He was very unhappy when he saw a Russian movie that had a couple of actors who were deeply kissing very passionately, and he was a bit of a prude, and he actually outlawed kissing for several years in Russian cinema. This is true, and it took a while, maybe after the war, before they got back to kissing. Well, if he saw Tarzan, he would have seen, you know, some pretty exciting scenes. As I said, Tarzan's popularity has not waned. This is a Russian translation of the novel, and you can find you know, that today. He's still popular up until today. The influence of Tarzan has not faded. So anyway, all these wonderful trophy films were the dominant kind of window into the world that the Russian people had. And the Russian cinema coming out of World War II, remember, between 1945 and the early 50s, Russia was struggling, barely able to rebuild, you know, a tremendous challenge, and not to mention the challenge politically of Stalin with his, you know, increasingly difficult dictatorship that he was running. And finally, he dies in 1954, and Khrushchev, with some difficulty, comes to power. And then, if you fast forward a quick 3 years, you come to a watershed moment in the Cold War. Now, up to this point, even though the Russians by now had developed the A-bomb and then the hydrogen bomb, and there certainly was a tremendous amount of tension and, you know, feeling that, you know, we could go to war with Russia, war would still be, by comparison, relatively conventional. If you imagine planes with dropping bombs, still a big deal, but that was right out of 1940s and World War II. But October 4th, 1957, what happened was the launch of the famous Sputnik satellite. Now, this was a watershed moment, of course, in the Cold War for Russia, for the Soviet Union, and for the United States and the West as well. I've seen this mock-up in a wonderful exhibit a couple of years ago in the Bruce Museum in Connecticut, and it's just about the size of a large exercise ball that you might see at the YMCA. Now, when the satellite was discovered, it was, the Russians did not announce it. There were Western tracking devices that found out about this satellite out there, and it was just a bombshell for politics and culture and everybody in the West. And this is a well-known story. Everybody suddenly dropped all their courses in college in art and literature, and they ran over to the science and math department, and because we had to, you know, take up the challenge of meeting the Russians in this race to develop technology and missile technology. Because what our missiles were doing was not getting into space, as is well known. They were blowing up right on the launch pads. It was just a constant one disaster after another. They were shown on TV. Everybody knew about them. The US military was tremendously embarrassed by this. And the guy who, there were two lines of rocketry development at this time in the US. One was the Vanguard missile program, the Vanguard rocket program. And this is one of our Vanguard rockets blowing up yet again. And there was another program being developed by none other than Wernher von Braun, the ex-Nazi who was a brilliant rocket scientist. He had developed the V2 rocket, and he was developing his, building on his V2 rocket technology on what finally, well, he kept telling the military, guys, I've got a better rocket, the Jupiter rocket. You know, why don't you give me a try? Well, after the Vanguard blew up one too many times, and this was just a few weeks, this particular failure, after the first Sputnik went up, the military said, okay, von Braun, you know, we'll give your Jupiter rocket a try. And just 2 months after this, at the end of January 1958, the US was able to successfully launch its first satellite into space with the Explorer 1 on the Jupiter rocket. Because the US press was, you know, coming up with headlines like this for our exploding missiles, the Flopnik. Now, you can imagine how the Soviets were taking it when they would look on TV and watching our rockets blowing up. Well, Khrushchev, just before the Sputnik went up, got onto Time magazine in an interview, and it's this wonderful expression on his face. You can sort of imagine him watching American television as our rockets are blowing up, and he knows he's got a rocket that he's ready to launch into space, and he's hoping it's going to be a success. And of course it is. And he even came up, when in the interview with the Western reporter, came up with this kind of goofy idea of, you know, thinking, well, you know, I could, let's have a peaceful rocket contest with the West, you know, just like a shooting match, and they'll see for themselves, meaning the West will see who's got the better technology. And, you know, this was more than just a one-off success, of course. Shortly after Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2 went up with one of the first cosmonaut, the first Earthling of any kind to get out in space. And this is in that exhibit I was telling you about at Bruce Museum. This was the dog, a mock-up of the capsule that the famous dog Leica went up in. Now, Leica was actually a stray that was picked up on the streets of Moscow by the astronaut, the whole missile astronaut program by the Russians. And they found her very compliant, very cooperative, a terrific dog, and they trained her with a whole lot of other dogs and picked her to be the first to go up in space. And here you see a picture of Leica herself in training. And there's on the left, a package of Leica cigarettes. Leica became a rock star when when the Russian people found out about her going up into space. Now, unfortunately, Leica had a one-way ticket on this trip, and there was no coming back for Leica. Now, they had the capsule set up so that she'd have air to breathe and heat and some food to eat, and it was expected she would last several days during this launch and experiment. But they had no way to get her back safely. Unfortunately, they had a technical failure, and within 15 minutes of her getting into space, the heating system and oxygen system failed, and she quickly died. It wasn't for 30 years later that the Russian people found out about that. She was too much of a rock star to let people know that she didn't make it back. And while we were showing the world our rockets exploding, the Russians, the Soviets, were not showing the world everything or their own people. They showed the successes. They had a lot of struggles with their whole space program all along, but you know, they were tightly controlling information, and that's what they showed. Today there's a memorial and a monument to Leica the dog. She's still very famous, and that's in Moscow. Over the next couple of years, there were 4 Sputniks, I think, and in 1960, there were 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, a male and a female, who went up into space with a bunch of other little animals, including some insects and a rabbit and I think a frog. And they had a round-trip ticket, and in fact, they successfully returned to Earth. And they became real rock stars. And the Russians were great at promoting and celebrating all of this. And look at all the merchandising that came out of it. You know how Hollywood loves to merchandise, you know, stuff like Star Wars figures. Well, the Russians were pretty good. They figured it all out. And there was all this wonderful merchandising during the early time in the space program. And there's a wonderful story that Belka and Strelka, who were not boyfriend and girlfriend, Strelka got another boyfriend whom she had puppies with. And Khrushchev got one of those puppies and he gave it as a gift to President Kennedy in 1961. And the US authorities accepted the gift with thanks, nice diplomatic gesture. And there's a story that they did a lot of careful, let's say, you know, examination of the puppy to make sure that there were no hidden listening devices or anything else that might be in the dog, hidden there by those tricky Russians. But it was a serious, I mean, a genuine gift, and Kennedy gave it to his daughter Caroline. And not long after, that dog had puppies, and Kennedy referred to them as little pupniks. And there's some cool pictures online you can see of that. Well, the diplomatic and cultural challenges of the time were many. And in the famous kitchen debate in Moscow in 1959, this is now a year and a half after Sputnik, but the reverberations are still going on. Now, Nixon traveled to Moscow for an American exposition where all these American products like GE washing machines and SOS soap pads were on display. And by the way, don't miss, I hope you can see obviously Nixon in the center, Khrushchev is next to him, and over Nixon's left shoulder there's a figure whose face you must recognize. I'll leave it to you to remember who that is. And now I'm going to quickly, I hope, do a quick showing of a film clip, about a 10-second clip. And if I can get this all to work, I'm going to stop screen sharing this, and I'm going to do another screen share. Bear with me, I've got this teed up, and hopefully I can run this. And here it goes. This is a clip from the extemporaneous kitchen debate that continued for a couple of days when Nixon and Khrushchev got together.
A free exchange of ideas. There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us...
Okay, we'll go back now to the show. So I hope you got the point out of that quick clip. It's really fun to watch those on YouTube. You can get them really easily, of course, where Nixon famously and really clumsily says, as you hear, you get the wonderful look on Khrushchev's face as he's patiently listening to the translation. He's got that goofy hat on his head, and Nixon says, well, you're ahead of us in rockets, but we've got color television. And you know, Khrushchev and the world saw that, and you know, the meaning of it was pretty obvious. We looked like we were falling behind, and this was really no joke. Now, this whole period in Russia, starting with Sputnik and going on for many years, is known to scholars as the period culturally of cosmic enthusiasms, as the English translation would have it. And if you look at the famous Soviet red star with the hammer and sickle, it symbolizes many things, but including the idea of searching for the stars. Launching the Soviet system was really all about this, the future. It was about conquering the solar system and achieving a kind of utopian future through that. And the success of the missile or the rocket launches of Sputnik were seen as a proof of the inherent superiority and value of the Soviet system and the Soviet man, the modern Soviet man and woman, who were achieving things that capitalism could never achieve. In 1956, Khrushchev freaked out the American public when he said to journalists, and diplomats, "We will bury you," meaning the West. We will bury the West. What he meant by that was not that we're going to come over and drop bombs on you. That's how it was taken, for good reason. That's how it sounded. What he meant was our Soviet system is going to bury capitalism, and we're going to prevail. And you will realize this soon enough. Khrushchev felt, and he told his government that he felt it would take until 1980 for the Soviet system really to get strong enough in every sense, economically and technically, to totally succeed, and socialism would prevail by 1980. That was his expectation. So the cosmic enthusiasms period in Russia was very important to that, because the Russian government was promoting space and the space race as really just a parallel to the whole Soviet system and everything it was trying to accomplish. And so they were full of wonderful propaganda, booklets and posters. The way is open for the man, and they're really fun to look at. Now, what were we looking at? Well, the most popular movie in 1958 was Around the World in 80 Days. So you again get this kind of comical contrast of, Americans watching technology of, going around the world in a balloon, while the Russians are sending rockets to the stars. That wonderful, Soviet star, emblematic of that. Motherland, you were the first to spark a star of peace and progress above the earth. Glory to science, glory to labor, glory to the Soviet system. There was one, and I don't have a copy of it, really funny anecdote. What it is the Soviets had produced that kind of a paperback booklet, which they widely distributed to the Soviet people, where they could see depictions of Soviet space rockets. And they had some drawings of these rockets and some technical drawings. And you look through it, you could see the wonderful technology of the Soviet rocket system. Now, these were not actual technical drawings from actual technical Soviet rockets. The Soviets weren't dumb enough to do that, but the American intelligence geniuses studied these drawings when they got a hold of one of these publications, because they were trying to figure out some of the, what were the technical successes that the Soviets were using, and they were studying these things thinking they were actually the real deal. They figured out, of course, that they weren't. I can't get enough of these wonderful images. Look at the red stars out there, this powerful cosmonaut with a space helmet. Glory to the Soviet people, the space pioneers. Well, this is another time cover with Khrushchev on it, and it's not the same image of Khrushchev, is it? No. Why? Because what was really at stake here was not the space race of who was going to be first to do space accomplishments. It was all about the idea that if you have rockets that can send satellites into space, you have missiles that, instead of a satellite on the top, could have a nuclear bomb on the top. And you could send those ICBMs across the world to, you wouldn't need you wouldn't need planes to drop bombs. You could have missiles. In 15 minutes could land hydrogen bombs in your enemy territory. And that's what was at stake. And that's why the US had freaked out. By the way, when the Sputnik went up, newspaper reporters went to President Eisenhower, and they really got up in his face about, what is America doing about this? Ike badly bungled that very serious public relations flop of his. I mean, he just dismissed it as, oh, it's nothing to worry about. Don't worry about it. And people were very upset at his kind of casual reaction, dismissing it. Now, the Russians, at the time, we were still a whole other part of the story, going back and forth with them on nuclear testing, atmospheric nuclear testing of hydrogen bombs. These enormous bombs got bigger and bigger until the Russians actually set off a bomb they nicknamed Tsar Bomba, which was a 50 megaton device, bigger than anything the Russians even realized they would generate. It's the largest hydrogen bomb ever tested. And the situation was getting pretty serious. Who had the biggest bombs and who had the missiles? In the presidential contest of 1960, Nixon's kitchen debate fiasco came back to haunt him. And John Kennedy, when he ran for Senate in 1958, his re-election for Senate, he had been there for one term, came up with the idea of the missile gap. And he started talking about a missile gap, and he started presenting himself as a young, tough, cold warrior, veteran, of course, of World War II, as Nixon had been, and someone who was going to not give those kind of casual answers that the old man Eisenhower gave, but he was going to show the Russians that he was on top of things. And in the debate in October 1960, the televised debate with Nixon, he brought up the missile gap and he pounded him with it. And if you look at that whole debate, you see Nixon looking flummoxed as he tries to answer, the question about the missile debate, which he is minimizing. And the fact is that, as Kennedy well knew, there was no missile gap. It was a fiction. Kennedy had found that out. He'd gotten the reports, and he darn well knew that in 1960, neither the Russians nor the US had more than just a handful of missiles. In 1960, the Russians later admitted they had 4 of them, and the US had about the same number. There was no missile gap until about 1964, when the Americans had about 5 times the number of missiles. Nevertheless, the public got really upset, and Kennedy, on a razor-thin margin, won the presidency. So in 1961, Kennedy's president, and there go the Russians again. They're first again at something, and they get the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. And he too has a round-trip ticket, and he comes back to, of course, worldwide notoriety and celebration. So there's Gagarin in his spacesuit on the left, and on the right, there is Gagarin with his infant child and Mrs. Gagarin. And there's this wonderful anecdote that after Gagarin went up in space and came back safely, his wife gets a phone call. It's an official from the Soviet space program, and she says, "Comrade, I have wonderful news for you. Your husband, Yuri, has returned home safely." And she says, "Returned home from where? What do you mean? What are you talking about?" She had no idea. She had not been told what her husband was doing. And contrast that to the way the American media would have cameras and reporters outside the houses of the American astronauts when their husbands were taking off on those rockets and out there in space, and the wives were watching nervously. Poor Mrs. Gagarin knew nothing. The Soviets were controlling the information, to say the least. 1963, yet again the Soviets have the first female cosmonaut, Valentina Tereshkova, who was successfully went on that mission. And she was not a trained pilot like Gagarin. She was actually just kind of a regular person who happened to be the daughter of a very famous, highly decorated Russian war hero in World War II. And they picked her for that reason, because they wanted to have for propaganda purposes, someone who was not some kind of scientist or pilot. They trained her, she did a great job, and she became the first woman. Back in America, Claire Booth Luce, who was a very famous conservative diplomat and politician and author, wrote a scathing article in Life magazine, which happened to be owned by her husband, Henry Luce. In it, she talked about how America was falling behind in recognizing the equality of women. She was a serious feminist, and she wrote this scathing article about how come the Russians, recognize the value of women. They put a Russian astronaut into space, and in America, women are still relegated to the role of secretaries. The Russian celebration of their Soviet space heroes, which went on for a long time. Here you get an example of this enormous 350-foot monument to the conquerors of space. It's in Moscow. You get a sense of the way they celebrated this and still look back on their space culture with a tremendous amount of genuine nostalgia. Well, as we know, the space race a few years later did not go to the Russians. The race to the moon, which it became all about for public consumption, in addition to building missiles for purposes of their nuclear, our nuclear forces. This very famous, iconic photo taken from the Apollo 8 Earthrise shows that, we get to the moon first. It was only 6 months later, 1969, that we do land on the moon. And the Russians have to accept the fact that, they're not going to win the ultimate space race, and the Americans do. But of course, both sides worked on their missile defense forces and attack forces, and they built hundreds and then thousands of missiles. And just to go back to Kennedy and Khrushchev for a second, 6 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated the first serious nuclear test ban treaty that basically banned all atmospheric testing. It was an enormously important watershed to the great credit of Khrushchev and Nixon. Nixon, of course, died, was assassinated just a few months later, and a year later, Khrushchev was out and Brezhnev was in. The Cold War was changing in a lot of ways at this point. It wasn't exactly, we're getting towards the period of daytime. Nixon is now president, having been elected in '68. And there was an interesting movie, not a great movie, but a good movie called Marooned, a Western Hollywood film, where some astronauts are marooned in space. They can't get back and they have to be rescued. And this movie actually inspired both NASA and their Soviet counterparts to really actually think about, well, what would happen, if that happened? Would we be able to help each other out? What if there was a space mission, some accident that really required cooperation between our countries? And that actually sparked what eventually became the Apollo Soyuz mission in 1975, where space vehicles from our two countries linked up in space. And this is, an image from that and one of the emblems from that famous mission. And they attribute it to that spark from the Hollywood movie. So again, it's really kind of interesting in all my research to kind of toggle back and forth between how movies reflected or had an actual influence in politics and culture of the time. Now, science fiction was not unknown in Russia just because they didn't have movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Earth versus the Flying Saucers and Flash Gordon, and they didn't have TV shows like Star Trek, and they didn't have aliens and ray guns. But they had a big science fiction tradition, but it was very different from ours. Instead of all that swashbuckling, you know, Captain Kirk running around, kissing women and so on, and going after Klingons. And by the way, the Klingons were very much, you know, allegorical stand-ins for our Russian enemies in the 1960s. The Russians, Russian film industry, which was now back in business, and I don't know a lot about it, so I'm certainly far from even remotely an expert on it, but this is a very, very important, groundbreaking science fiction movie called Solaris, very famous, very interesting, very, very cerebral. Their science fiction subjects had to do with lots of interesting things about philosophy and culture and how people were dealing with their lives. And it was an opportunity that Russian artists had for many years to talk about subjects that might have been difficult to do with, you know, the Soviet state censors looking over their shoulders. And so science fiction became a way for them to express themselves, very importantly. We fast forward to the 1980s when the Cold War at this point is really beginning to wind down. And we've got Gorbachev and Reagan negotiating, and Glasnost and Perestroika is making it possible for a lot of things to be thought about, talked about in Russia. And you have this, I've only seen this in the Russian version. There's no version that I've gotten with subtitles, so it's hard for me to totally understand, but it basically is a post-nuclear war apocalyptic scene, Letters from a Dead Man, a very moving film. We had been doing, Hollywood had been making movies about post-World War III going back for a long time, famously in On the Beach, later on Road Warriors, but there were lots and lots of these post-apocalyptic stories. And this was a famous one in Russia. Now that same year, coincidentally, but I just had to throw up this photo as a comparison. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 happened. A kind of very limited post-nuclear apocalypse, and sort of created its own little mini dystopia around Chernobyl, and with lots of ramifications because of where the wind carried all that fallout. And if you don't know about it, you should look. You should watch the terrific TV miniseries, American-made or British-made, of a couple of years ago on the whole Chernobyl story. It's really great. You can get it on Netflix or whatever. I highly recommend it. I'll talk about this in a second. Lastly, in 1987, some Hollywood directors invited some Russian filmmakers to come to a conference where together they discussed and talked about their history of movies during the Cold War. And they looked at each other's films, some they hadn't seen before. And what happened was the Russian film directors were kind of astonished, and the American Hollywood directors were really astonished because they didn't realize that there was no comparative films in the Russian, on the Russian side, where American movies had lots and lots of movies where the Russians were the bad guys, spy movies, you know, all those, as I said, the Klingons were really the Russian boogeymen in disguise in Star Trek. And the Russians weren't doing that. The Russian films, as the film industry, you know, got back on its feet in the 50s and 60s, they were making dramatic films of Russian heroics against the enemy, but the enemy were the Nazis and maybe the White Guard of the 1920s, which were the pro-Tsarist counter-revolutionaries. But they just didn't see Americans as the boogeyman. And when I was hiding under my desk in school, like I showed in that first photo, I was thinking about the Russians are coming and they're going to drop bombs on us. And you know how the old phrase of, you know, people who wouldn't go to sleep because they were looking for Russia, you know, Reds under their beds. And Russian people didn't have that mentality. And they really didn't know that much about World War III and so on. Because the Soviet propaganda forces were not portraying that in a big way. So it was a really interesting development when the Iron Curtain went down and this began to come out. Okay, so fast forward now to 2005, and I will quickly describe this almost impossible to describe mockumentary made by some Russian filmmakers called First on the Moon, and I've seen it. You can get it on YouTube with subtitles. The only thing I can say about it, the concept is that it is a documentary that purports to find all this secret information from the Soviet era, the 1930s, that proves that the Soviet rocket program had developed so that they sent a cosmonaut to the moon and back in the 1930s. Now, this is not intended to be real. It's intended to be a concept that what if it had happened? What if the Russians had been first on the moon in the 1930s? It's just an extraordinary piece of work. I've never seen anything quite like it. 2 years later, in 2007, the Russians celebrated the anniversary of Sputnik. Now, cosmic enthusiasms, as I've said, and the space culture in Russia, you know, had not died off. And, you know, celebrating Sputnik and everything that the Russians had accomplished by getting to space first, putting the first man in space, Leica, Spelka, and Drelka, and so on. And, you know, they, you know, commemorated the 50th anniversary with coins and so on and so forth and stamps. They made a big deal out of it. And Putin was very proud of the event too. And now, if you think the legend of Sputnik, you know, has faded away, of course, it hasn't, because we have Sputnik 5 or Sputnik V, depending on how you want to read it, which the Russians got to the vaccine for COVID first. And they knew what they were doing when they decided to name it Sputnik V. And they wanted everybody to remember that, you know, the Russians want respect and deserve respect for their scientific prowess. That was really a mentality that, you know, somewhat comparable to what they felt in 1957, having come out of World War II and the devastation they'd overcome. They were first to get rockets in space, and now here we are 50 years later, and they were the first to get the vaccine to combat the pandemic we face today. So I'll come to a close and leave you with a last look at my hero, Leica, the astronaut dog. I can remember vividly when I was a kid and Sputnik was a big deal, and I found out they'd sent dogs in space. And, you know, we had a dog at home, and, you know, goodness, you know, could they really do that? And I didn't know that Leica only had a one-way ticket either, like the Russian kids. I didn't know any better. And there's this wonderful kids book, which I got online, and I gave it to my my daughter for our first grandson when he's ready to read it. And the story is that Leica has gone into space, and she's fine. The technology is working great, and she's way out in the solar system, and she doesn't have a return trip ticket, remember. But fortunately, there just happens to be a spaceship passing by our solar system, being driven by some aliens from another world and another part of our galaxy. And it's a man and his wife and his kids. It's a nice nuclear family from another solar system. And they see, you know, the space refugee Leica, and they rescue her, and they bring her into their rocket, and they fly back home, and she becomes the household pet of this wonderful, kind alien nuclear family from another planet. So Leica survives, and that's the way I think about it. Leica survived and probably had many little pupniks over the decades. So thank you very much. I end my talk there. Really appreciate you coming aboard for this. And I will now happily open the floor for any questions or thoughts, comments, or reflections on the time.